I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote presentation. I was just sitting over at my table and I was telling my friend Caitlin there, I got a weird text from my sister who's an Indigenous chef, and she sent me this text and I didn't understand it, and it said, I talked to them but they're not ready, so I'm going to come and get them next week. And I had no idea what she was talking about. She hasn't texted me in like 2 weeks. I had no idea what she was talking about, and I sent her back a why with a bunch of question marks on a text message. And she sent me back, she said, the sunflowers. I was like, this is the most Indian text I have gotten in a long time. But our Indigenous chefs are bringing back our language of speaking to these plant relatives, to the food, and they are restoring things that were attempted to be ripped away from us. And Sean is definitely one of the ones who is leading that. And I know my sister really looks up to his work and to everything that he has done, because we all need to be talking to the sunflowers so they can come and they can tell us to come back on Wednesday, because that's when they'll be ready. That's what her text message said. So she'll be there Wednesday taking the sunflowers, which I want to acknowledge again to my Hopi relatives who I've had time spending with, and they gifted me those seeds. So thank you to those Hopi people. So Chef Sean Sherman has been cooking across the United States and Canada for the past 30 years and is renowned nationally and internationally in the culinary movement of Indigenous foods. His main focus has been on the revitalization and evolution of Indigenous food systems through North America. In 2014, he opened a business titled The Sioux Chef as a caterer and food educator in Minneapolis-St. Paul area. His first book, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, was awarded the James Beard Medal for Best American Cookbook in 2018. And it was chosen as one of the top cookbooks of 2017 by the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and the Smithsonian Magazine. This year, Chef Sean was selected as a Bush Fellow, as well as receiving a 2019 Leadership Award by the James Beard Foundation. So I just want to welcome him to the stage, and we are so honored to have him here to talk to us tonight.
All right. How mitakiape? Happy wash day. One bli matakpe inichiape. My name is Sean Sherman. I am from Pine Ridge, South Dakota. I was born and raised on the reservation, and we have been doing this company with the Sioux Chef since 2014. But it's come from a much longer path for myself personally to really try and understand the work that we're doing today. And it was really about trying to understand, what are exactly Indigenous foods when it came to the question, because I'd been a chef for quite a long time. I actually started working in restaurants at a really young age, because when I was really young, my mom moved my sister and I off of the Pine Ridge and into the Black Hills, and we moved to a small town called Spearfish. And I started working in restaurants at a really young age when I was barely 13. And they still hired kids at a really young age. They didn't seem to mind that in South Dakota at that time. And I just worked really hard all through high school, all through college. And after college, I moved here to Minneapolis. And I started my career shortly after that as a chef. I got my first chef position when I was fairly young. I think I was 26. And it was a lot of fun to work in this environment, because around Minnesota, there's a lot of beautiful farms, there was a lot of beautiful food, and I got lucky as a chef to start to work in restaurants that were really focused on farm to table at a time when it was barely a thing in the early 2000s. And I really made a great relationship with a lot of the farmers, and we were able to bring a lot of these foods and think outside the box, literally, and be able to have this really great, just relationship with the farmers and growers around us, and, working to figure out systems of how do we get farm food out from around our surrounding area and into the restaurants so we could share it with people, and to be able to make fun foods and to showcase different flavors that people might not have been used to. So I had a lot of fun working with that style of cooking in Minneapolis here. And I eventually kind of had this epiphany moment because I was working in, of course, in Minneapolis, in the uptown area, and there's Minneapolis is a progressive food city. There's a lot of cool foods. There's a lot of you can find food from all over the world just walking around. There's food from everywhere. But it was just the realization that there was no food that represented exactly where we were standing. And it was really eye-opening for me to see that, especially as a chef who had spent so much time just like absorbing culinary knowledge and really trying to understand foods and different cultures from around the world, and even being able to travel to different countries and experience and really research where food was coming from, to have the realization that I didn't even know that much about my own heritage and my own background when it came to foods. So I started looking around, and there wasn't a lot out there. I always tease that I couldn't just go online and buy Joy of Native American Cooking to figure it all out, because that didn't exist. There was obviously it was really hard to find any information on there. And looking through cookbooks, like my mom gave me a cookbook from Pine Ridge, and she's like, "Oh, we already have a Native cookbook," and this is like. Well, I mean, it kind of looked like a Lutheran cookbook a little bit, because like everything was cream of mushroom soup and, like Jell-O molds and stuff like that. And it's like, I'm looking for something a little bit different, Mom, So, because in my vision, like I had this, this vision of that knowledge of the plants and the world around us. I wanted to know like what was going on with my Lakota ancestors directly. What were they really eating before they were influenced by European cultures? I want to know what they were growing, what they were trading, what they were harvesting in the wild, the animals around them, all of these questions that I had in my mind that I wanted to try and figure out. And I couldn't just ask one person. I couldn't just look in one book. I had to just keep searching, So it was quite a few years of searching and trying to understand all of these pieces. And it really helped me grow, because not only did I start to really piece together this information from many sources, from elders, from lots of ethnobotanical texts and a lot of history books, and just being outdoors and experiencing foods and getting to know the plants. I started to see history and land differently too. I started to see like the true stories of people, of how we all ended up to where we are today. And I started learning about a whole bunch of more different cultures than my own. And seeing like so many of the same stories have happened to Indigenous peoples across the board. So the food gave me this window to be able to really peek into it and to study history and to do something about it. So when I started doing these foods, I really wanted to give it a lot of respect and try to cook with only Indigenous foods of the region that we happen to be in. And that was a really important challenge that we still carry today with the works that we try and do. We really try to make food taste like exactly where we are. Anybody can fusionize foods and blend things together, and that's a lot of fun, but we just wanted to showcase the base and the foundation of all these flavors and all that diversity across the board. So today we're looking at the history of Indigenous peoples from Mexico all the way up through Alaska as our primary focus, and we're really focused on that piece, And we're just learning so much because, we get to have this voice. We get to come and talk to people who don't have any sense of Indigenous cultures at all, and get to showcase this food and get them to open their eyes and to think about it and get to talk about history. Because no matter where we are in North America, we're standing on Indigenous land, and there's Indigenous history. So, and in Minnesota, I always get to tell people that there actually is history before Laura Ingalls on this landscape, right? Despite what our history books told us, there's a lot of deep history, and we can learn so much from Indigenous cultures. But I think it's really important to understand the history of how did we lose so much, Because in my lifetime, I was born in 1974, and I think about 100 years prior to my birth, 1874 in South Dakota. At that point in time, the Black Hills haven't even discovered the gold in the Black Hills at that point in time. The Lakota and all the other groups were still out there. My family was still living the way they always had at that point in time, just 100 years prior to my birth. So why did so much change? Why did we lose so much knowledge? And why did we come so far where when I grew up, I had scarcely any idea of what my Indigenous foods were? So it's a big part of the story, and it's a big part of our healing process to know some of these pieces to move forward. So we use a lot of terms like pre-contact foods, pre-colonial foods, and things like that, pre-reservation foods. And it's important to know this part of the story. So to really understand what pre-colonial foods are, I always start with like, what is colonialism in general first? I think that's a really important question to really get, because we see all these like decolonize, and we have to really understand, what does that actually mean, you know? So the easiest way to understand colonialism is just to Google it. So if you Google colonialism, you get a nice description. It just says, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And this is something that we've seen, of course, in history a lot across the globe. And we look at indigenous peoples across the globe as a connection, you know, because it doesn't matter if you're from Africa or India or Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, South America. We share this commonality of the same history of being overrun by primarily European monarchs and making Europe extremely rich. And we see the same thing happen to us here in North America. A lot of this is stemmed from the doctrine of discovery, which basically the Europeans gave themselves the okay to say, like, okay, if we discover it, then we own it, right? And things just don't obviously work that way, but almost all of our land ownership rules out there have been based on that simple principle, you know? Today in the United States, 98% of all private land are owned by white males, and that's a statistic that's right here today. The United States adopted manifest destiny from the doctrine of discovery, giving them they believed that they could just have everything coast to coast, and it was a part of their destiny to make that a reality, which they eventually did. So we get to have this opportunity to tell a lot of people how recent in history a lot of this stuff happened, because so much of our history books talk about our cultures and our history of something that happened so far in the past, when we know that's not the truth. You know, when our country is brand new in the late 1700s, and the U.S. government is still trying to figure out what they're doing, you know, almost all of this landscape is completely owned by indigenous peoples. And it moves really fast when the U.S. government sets its sights on starting to take over indigenous lands and push towards the West. So even in the beginning of the 1800s, they still had very little, the U.S. government did, but it goes really fast, and we see an immense amount of trauma happening to our indigenous communities across the board, and it goes throughout that entire century. So by the time the century's over in the 1900s, 2% of the land is occupied by indigenous peoples at that point. And during this time frame, a mass amount of trauma, like I said, is happening because people are getting removed from their homelands. Genocide is happening at alarming rates, which should always be alarming. And you know, people are being forced marched everywhere. Reservation systems are being built, and there's a whole bunch of change happening really quickly for a lot of indigenous peoples. I think about my great-grandfather, who was born in Dakota in the late 1850s, and he sees during his lifetime all these more and more battles with the U.S. government in the Dakota, leading up to the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he was 18 years old during that battle with the Dakota, and then eventually seeing everybody getting pushed onto Pine Ridge Reservation, eventually seeing his kids growing up in boarding schools and cutting their hair and learning to speak English only, and then eventually even seeing his children grow up and fight for the U.S. government. So like so much twist of stuff to see in one single lifetime, you know? And that's something that happened. And you know, during this time period, like it was obviously a dangerous time period to be indigenous during those 1800s. One of the parts of like how a U.S. territory became a U.S. statehood, you know, one of the criterias was the white population had to outnumber the indigenous population. So, and that made it really dangerous for indigenous peoples because they were just getting pushed out. And that's how, you know, they were able to become a state. And the U.S. government was very concise about how they were making these things happen, starting with the Indian Removal Act from Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, and then the Homestead Act of 1862 of breaking up more land. Then we see the Indian Appropriation Act of reclassifying indigenous peoples as basically wards of the federal government. And then the Dawes Act of 1887, which continued to further even break up more indigenous land. So we see so much indigenous land lost. And I think it's always important to talk about like where we are, because we carry all these stories, but a lot of these stories are important to learn about where you are today. So in 1862 and 1863, we saw the Winnebago and Dakota Sioux Expulsion Acts. The Dakota Sioux Expulsion Acts in 1863, what happened after the Dakota rose up to try and fight for their way of life, after all of these treaties were being broken, and they were eventually overcome. Some of them were able to flee and head out west, and a lot of them were rounded up into a concentration camp. During this time period, they passed the Dakota Expulsion Act, making it illegal to be a Dakota person in Minnesota, along with the Winnebago, who didn't really have anything to do with any of this going on. And the Winnebago had already been moved around quite a few times, but they were also bound together and kicked out of Minnesota. And the craziest part about that history is that those federal laws that passed in Congress and the government have never actually been uplifted. So in the federal books, it's actually still illegal to be a Dakota or Winnebago person in the state of Minnesota. So we have a lot of work to do as indigenous peoples, to be able to turn around a lot of these pieces, And, we look like these are all fake boundaries anyways. Like they didn't even know how to draw Minnesota state lines back then. It was almost going to be more horizontal, and it ended up being along the Red River line that went north and south instead. But it's important to think about all these treaties that, should have been honored during those time periods, and like how much more land we should have been able to control as indigenous peoples, and like how much, how we could have been taking care of this land so much better. But we had so many people against us in this state particularly that really just wanted to see us driven out of this state forever, basically. And there was even a group in Mankato called the Knights of the Forest that were using all of their influence. They were very much like a KKK kind of secret gathering of people, of very influential people that were out there to make sure that these laws were placed and people were kicked out. So, during that time period, that concentration camp that happens on Fort Snelling, so many people were deported. They shipped them all the way down to where the Missouri River meets the Mississippi, and then shipped all the way up into Oak Creek, South Dakota, which is where my grandmother's, my mom's mom's family comes from that lineage of being forced into South Dakota. And they actually put the Winnebago and the Dakota right next to each other, which was not a good scenario at that time either. But I'm going to skip this slide. But what really happens to us as indigenous peoples is the loss of indigenous foodways during this time period, because our landscape changed so fast, so drastically, when we lost control over what we had been land stewards of for so long, and really a part of the ecosystem. We had been a balance. We had been a balance with the bison, a balance with the plants. Like we were a part of the ecosystem and not above it. But during the opening of colonialism, we see this mass amount of resources being pulled and commodified, and just an immense amount of destruction happening on a natural scale, which disrupts everything, right? And then we also see, from the U.S. government side, actively destroying our foodways to try and subdue us. So the first thing that George Washington does when he's president is send his general out to punish the natives, and destroys massive crops, like 6 mile by 6 mile corn rows, or like fields of corn and produce, and just destroying and burning seed stocks and savings and everything, and trying to push them out. Because it's an act of war. If you can control food, you can control people, and it's just something that people have done. And in the West, we saw the mass destruction of bison, of course, because there were millions of those animals, and they were actively taking them out during that time period. And by the end of the 1860s, so few were left alive, and even by the end of 1900, only less than 500 animals survived that onslaught, and we lost so much of that animal, which messes up everything everything because they were part of the ecosystem. They were roaming huge tracts of land. They were spreading seeds and plants along with them. We see our Timsala, which is a prairie turnip that I grew up with on the Dakota plains, that was a part of that ecosystem that worked with the bison everywhere they went. And even the creation of barbed wire fences further stopped the flow of natural animal patterns and just disrupting, the environment at a really high rate. So we lost so much of our food during, but what I see as being most damaging to us as Indigenous peoples was really the eradication of our Indigenous education. So if you think about how do you define Indigenous education, right? Indigenous education is simply thousands of generations of knowledge being handed down to family member after family member, giving us the tools to live sustainably, utilizing primarily plant and animal knowledge around us, right? And all that tradition that comes with it. So when we start to lose this, especially after the reservation systems, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we see these assimilation efforts happening, that's when things really start to break apart, We're losing a lot of knowledge because this generation of children in the late 1800s who are growing up on a reservation should have at least been learning everything that their relatives have been passing down to them, all of their language, all their songs, all their traditions, all the skills to be able to utilize plants, to hunt, to fish, and to build things, and to learn how to teach that to the next generation, to continue that knowledge of passing it down over and over again. But instead, we see them forced into boarding school systems where they're forced to speak only English, and they're supposed to learn skills that have nothing to do with them, basically. So the person that starts those boarding school systems, Richard Pratt, is known for saying, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And he's saying "Oh, look what I can do to these young native children, we're civilizing them, but that's not, it's creating what becomes generations of trauma, right? This is a picture of the Pine Ridge boarding school where my grandparents went. We had boarding schools all across, we had boarding schools all across the U.S., and they're very concentrated in areas like where we are today. Canada had residential schools, same program, and these were alive all the way up until the 1990s, and they're so damaging. My mom went to boarding school, and she does not talk about boarding school. There was horrific things because they're learning religions that they don't have anything to do with. They're learning skills that, very servitude-type skills like carpentry and sewing and housekeeping. And this was not a fun school to go to because these were military schools that these kids were forced into. And there was harsh punishments. And this system of harshly punishing these kids is something that still resonates with us as Indigenous communities today, because the corporal punishment that they're using on these kids, Indigenous families would never even think about harming their children, before this era. But these era of kids who have to go through, who are beat, who are tortured, who are abused in many different ways, they grow up and that trauma carries on through our families. So we've seen a lot of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and all sorts of things that are directly related to this trauma that's happened to a lot of our family members who went through boarding school systems. We just met a woman who was 92 years old who became deaf in the boarding school system because they poured hot water down her ears, And there's a lot of these horrific stories that they were doing to these little tiny kids, during that time period. So we think about, after all that, we're lucky that we're still here after all these efforts to take us out, right? So we think about, what was going on after all this, because, I grew up in post-colonial Native America. And I'm a chef, so I always get a lot of media questions, and there are people who are like, "You're a chef," especially around Thanksgiving, they always get so much media requests. "What did you eat? You grew up on a reservation. What kind of foods did you eat?" Because they want to hear the story we'd get up in the morning, we'd take down an elk with a slingshot, and have a big family feast, and it would be great, pick a bunch of stuff along the way. But, the reality of things is, I primarily grew up on the commodity food program on Pine Ridge Reservation, And, it was not the healthiest base of foods to grow up on as a kid, And plus, they didn't look as pretty back then, too. They were just very basic for what they were. And, I don't want to get down. I know there's people here from the Commodity Food Program, and but I grew up with it, So I just remember, like, we lived way out in the country, and we were always the last kids to get to school. And by the time you get to school, they'd make us eat a quick breakfast so we'd have energy. And it was always a box of cereal and powdered milk. You just like open your box and pour it right into the bag. And then we'd have to have one shot of juice, and it was either a choice of orange juice or tomato juice. So by the time we always got to school, all the orange juice was always gone. So all I ever had was warm, room temperature tomato juice every morning. Canned government room temperature tomato juice, So I have some issues with Commodity Food Program. But the Commodity Food Program, really it starts in the 1930s to help needy families. And of course, the U.S. government's using it to also supply hospitals and school systems, military, all of this surplus that started as a farm supplement program. And the problem with it, it's been not the most nutritional program out there for quite a long time, because Indigenous peoples need different nutrition, and especially whatever nutritional model they had from early in the 1930s is obviously completely different, and it keeps changing anyways, But Indigenous peoples, we need a different diet, right? We need something that's particular to where we are, and we can't handle these high carb diets. We need a lot more protein, a lot more diverse vegetables. And we need food that's particularly where we come from, stuff that's passed down to us, that's where our health comes from, So like when we started doing the work that we do, we cut out all colonial ingredients just to prove a point. So we stopped using dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, even beef, pork, and chicken, just to showcase other alternative proteins. So when it comes to pieces like this, we just haven't done it. Like, we don't want to compete with it. It's something that's, like, I grew up with it. I love it. It's been a part of our families. But even when I was a young kid, I'd be like, I love Indian tacos, but it's weird our Dakota food tastes like Mexican food, So, but when you decolonize that, there's not much left to it, because we didn't have the fry bread, because we didn't have the flour, we didn't have ground beef, we didn't have weird California black olives, we didn't have sour cream or cheese, So, like, we can do so much better. Like, this one piece actually should not represent all of us as Indigenous people, especially in the lower 48, right? We're just way too diverse, and we have way too much offer to showcase. All of us are unique, and we have so much that we could be sharing that is not this piece, because this should not represent us. So to really truly understand an Indigenous food system, you just have to think about quite a couple of layers. Like, one layer is just thinking about how diverse North America is, how many different ecoregions there are, because it changes all over the place. You have, forest areas and swamps, you have high deserts, you've got coastal regions, you've got boreal forests, you got all sorts of stuff. And within this huge, massive continent, Indigenous peoples are living in every area, and there's different kinds of plants, different kinds of seasons. Like we're here in Minnesota, where we get about 3 months of summer and 18 months of winter, like pretty much every year, right? So, but it's really important to think about all the differences. Like, everything's so different. So you can't lump sum all Indigenous people into one group ever. It just doesn't work. So if you layer on language map, it's one way to start to see some diversity. So these are all mother tongues, and even within those very, those are big groups, and there's a lot more diversity than that, of course, because there's many different subdialects within that, and even just different languages in there, because our borders are fluid and they move around a little bit. But at least you can start to see some diversity of North America, from Mexico through Alaska. And just think about, like, our vision is to one day see Indigenous restaurants all across the board. And people could truly see that Indigenous diversity and the true backbone of what is North America. Because instead of like today, you just drive across and same hamburger, same Coca-Cola, even all the craft beer tastes exactly the same for some reason. I don't know. But we could just do so much better, and we would have so much to offer as Indigenous people across the board, because there's a lot of us alive today. 634 tribes in Canada, 573 in the U.S., and 229 of those are all in Alaska. And 20% of Mexico still speaks Indigenous languages today, right? So there's a lot of indigenous culture. And if you look at the difference, like for us, it doesn't matter who speaks English or Spanish or weird French. Like those are all like colonial languages, If you look at, if you break us up, like we're just so diverse, That's how we should be. We should be celebrating this diversity instead of trying to build border walls to stop it, We can learn from each other. So when we're looking at indigenous knowledge, we're looking at all of these pieces to make a whole, It's about understanding all of this: wild foods, agriculture, permaculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salt, sugar, fat production, indigenous crafting, land stewardship, cooking techniques, regional histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, sustainability. Like we're really diverse and we're really complicated as indigenous peoples, and it takes a lot to know. And it took whole communities to be able to do a part. Because in the old days, our communities, every single person played a part in the food system, and we have to do that too. Like we all have to chip in to make a better future. Because it doesn't matter if you're good at hunting or fishing or growing or harvesting things in the wild and identifying plants or processing foods or building crafts and tools to do hunting or fishing or harvesting, teaching kids, whatever it might be, passing on knowledge. Like everybody had to play a role in indigenous foods. And just think about, I have to decolonize everything really when it comes down to it, because like even our time frames, because we go by a 13 moon system as indigenous peoples, and our moons tell us what's happening in our regions at that time period, and all of our moon names are different across the board, like even within the same groups of people, right? So for us to be able to get this knowledge back, we reconnected with nature. It's reconnecting with the earth and feeling the true spirit of the land that you're on. And you can learn that through plants. The plants will tell you, and you can see how they're doing every year. You can see which plants struggle throughout the year, and which plants are flourishing throughout the year. And knowing that, like when you're out there and you're looking around at food or just looking around at plants, like you just have to start to get to know who they are, because every single plant out there has a purpose, and we can utilize that because our ancestors knew that knowledge, Plants are food, they're medicine, or you can craft with them and do something with them, right? You can make clothing, you can make shelter, you can make paints and dyes, you can do all sorts of stuff with these plants. So we have to regain this knowledge, and we have to think about what we're teaching our next generations, because this is important stuff, And I use this joke all the time, and it's old, and it's probably dated, but, I always say that our children can name more Kardashians than they can tree species, right? And that's unfortunate, and that's on us, because we need to be teaching them something that's really, truly important, and also learning the true names of these things. So putting them in the language of the land you're standing on. So we've been working with the Minneapolis Park Board on a few projects, and we are really excited because we're hoping that they're going to start to allow us to put the Dakota names on all of these plants of this region down here, because these are the true names of those plants, We should be able to know those, and we should be able to see them. Because we see so much great flavor, like choke cherries. If you guys haven't visited Wajupi Farm down here, you really should. They have such a beautiful indigenous orchard that's really growing and thriving, and it's such a great piece, and it's such a great model of what many people could do. Because we believe, like, we can landscape any way we want to, so we should just be putting food everywhere, right? There's just no reason to waste our landscape. We need to be making more food for our populations, for our future, for our children, and for their children. We have to think about the history of the foods that we've been eating, especially in the wild. We have to think about staples. So this is a picture of the timpsila that I grew up with on the Dakota Plains. There's things like the camas root in the Pacific Northwest and all over the West, really, when it comes to it. We're in this land where the wild rice is something so pure and beautiful, but we've destroyed so much of its home area and its waterways, and it's something that's so unique to the world, and we should be celebrating and protecting it always, because it's such a delicate thing. And people are using no petroleum products to be able to harvest this amazing crop, So we just really, people have to be connected to the land to know like how we could truly utilize our land for us, but we have to take care of it, and we have to put the respect back into it like our ancestors used to. We have to learn those old foraging songs and pay those respects and pay those dues as we take from it so we can give back to it. It's a really important part because this is a part of our histories. These are things that have been making families happy for millennia, you know? It's really important for all of us. And just thinking about, you know, plants in general, like water plants everywhere. You know, if you're on the coastal areas, you have a whole other world of plants and animals outside there that's a part of your food system. And it's so exciting. You know, chefs should be excited anyways to start to learn all of this untouched stuff that's all over the place everywhere, and like how much food is around us, you know. And even using the term food desert, you know, with indigenous peoples, we know that there's so much food in the desert. It's our life-giving, you know. It's a part of everything, and knowing how to harvest things carefully and sustainably so we're not damaging things. And knowing how to make sure that we're ensuring that they continue to grow as best they can and doing everything we can to help those plants. Proteins, I feel like, is an easier piece because basically any animal can be broken down, right? And we're very well aware of these sacred animals that have been around with us for a long time. And we've grown up seeing these things like how resourceful we were as indigenous peoples. But that's just because we were super resourceful for everything. It didn't matter if it was animals or plants. We just had to figure out the purpose of everything, you know? And we didn't have the entitlement to be wasteful. We didn't just throw things out. We had to figure out what everything could be utilized for. So any animal literally out there can be used for protein and for game, you know, and it's an important part of our diet. And we shouldn't just be stuck on those three animals of cow, beef, and pork, cow, pork, and chicken, just because those animals didn't even exist in these areas for not that long ago. You know, they weren't even around here. They were introduced to these regions. And it's fine for, you know, if you're an indigenous producer of chickens, beef, or pork, you know, we want to support you, but we also want people to think outside the box and to, you know, get more diverse protein in their bodies, because again, literally anything crawling around can be cooked up, you know. And we're happy to experiment with pretty much everything, and we got to play with all sorts of critters and shellfish and animals and even insects, which is so normal for so many parts of the world. If you go down in Mexico, like this is just, you can just like go to a Walmart and there's huge, gigantic bins of grasshoppers and grubs and things. That's a really great part of the food source. If you know how to cook them and make them taste good, then they're awesome. I took a small chef team with me down to Palm Springs early this spring where they're having this like, I think they called it a super bloom or something. I don't remember. There was a sensational word for it. But there was all of these caterpillars because the desert was lit up with flowers everywhere, and it's so beautiful. And there's all these caterpillars just marching all over the place, and the kids were complaining about it because we're teaching at the school for seniors all the way through like sixth graders, I think. And the kids are like, oh, they're just so gross, they're everywhere. We're like, well, actually, this used to be an indigenous food for the people that lived right here, and they're not bad. And some of the kids are like, oh, can we try them? I was like, okay. So we let the kids go out, pick with some tongs and a bucket, and they picked a whole bunch of caterpillars, and we brought them back in. And, you know, it was a really funny time because these kids just look at their faces. So we're going to boil them up first, and then we're going to fry them up with some chiles and some onions and some achiote. So we did all that, and even my cooks are like, are we doing this? I'm like, yeah, we're doing this, you know. But, you know, we made it look pretty, and we made it with stuff. We made it with wild foods around them. We made it taste good. And by the end of that, every single kid in that class ate a bug and was happy about it. And every single class afterwards, you know, wanted to do the same thing. So we just basically had bug eating class every single day, every class after that. I didn't get any calls from parents. I think we split town right away, so. But, you know, just have to think outside the box. There's no reason to be scared of something like insects because a lot of our ancestors as indigenous peoples utilize that as a protein source too, right? Indigenous agriculture, it's one that's extremely important to such a huge part of North America. We just look at agriculture as being something that can really produce so much for us, and we have so much of our histories tied to it where we do have it. And today's, you know, most people just think of agriculture as this piece, you know, but we know how damaging this is to our soils. We know that, all this land space being used for corporate farms, for monoculture, all the chemicals that are being put onto these plants, and it's actually getting into our foods, and there's all these studies of this direct links between these pieces and cancers and what's happening, and we're basically just giant lab rats for these huge seed companies to see what happens to entire populations when they eat too much of these really poisonous chemicals that are designed to do all sorts of stuff. They're messing with our genetics, it comes down to it, right? So when you see a headline like, how worried should we be that glyphosate was found in our Cheerios, you should be very worried, That's why it's really important to know exactly where your food comes from, to know that people aren't spraying things all over it, and to know who your farmers and growers are. And as Indigenous peoples, we can control that. If we're growing our own foods, we can absolutely control that. And it would be really important because we have to have so much respect for Indigenous agriculture and just know, its beginnings go back further than we can even really know for sure. Like, if you've ever been down to the Yucatan and the Mayan area, that civilization was so far advanced, not only in architecture and sciences, but agriculture. They were able to feed I don't even know, but, lots and lots and lots of people, right? And they had it really down really well. And we're still utilizing a lot of those seeds that they started so long ago, where they crawled up, because Indigenous agriculture, especially corn culture, starting from the bottom of Mexico, shooting both directions in North and South America, crawling all the way through Mexico, all the way throughout the entire Caribbean, all the way up the entire eastern seaboard, up the Mississippi and Missouri river valleys into our regions. We've had corn in so much large area, right? And we're growing a lot of the same things. It's corns and beans and squash, sunflowers and chili peppers where you have it, amaranth, and there's just so much of these domesticated crops out there. And when the Spanish first show up to what is Mexico City, and they found their city so clean and advanced, and they found their agricultural system so interesting because they're growing right in the middle of the lake. But it was such a beautiful system to keep that soil so rich because they kept their water so clean that they're able to continue to churn that and grow over and over again, just massive amounts of amazing stuff, Or in the desert areas where, this is a Zuni farm in northern New Mexico, and to figure out a system to produce massive amounts of food for thousands of years in an agricultural system in the middle of the desert, that's a huge feat to overcome, right? And we still are lucky that we have some of this stuff. We all know about Three Sisters, but we're again, this was not our only way of growing because we were so diverse as Indigenous peoples, These histories come more from the East Coast, when we look at our region, like Buffalo Bird Woman. If you guys ever find the book Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden, she's Hidatsa in North Dakota, and you can see the Missouri River Valley behind her, and she's not that far from where Standing Rock was. And she writes down all those memories of growing up a Hidatsa woman in the 1800s, of how she farmed without, she's using a buffalo shoulder bone hoe, she's using antler rakes, and all of those memories of farming from an Indigenous style before having any European influence. So it's so wonderful to have that book here in our lives to reference from, and it's such a unique look on Indigenous agriculture and such a rare look on from a female voice coming out of history, because rarely do we hear female voices in history at all, and even more rare would we hear an Indigenous female voice come out of history. So it's such an important book, and there's so much detail in it, of just how she all her memories written down into this wonderful text. And I know they have a few copies out there. They'll probably go fast now that I talked about it. But we're lucky that we have any of this seed diversity left, because we have no idea what was lost during that colonization period in the 1800s and parts of the 1700s. We're lucky that we have any of these. But these seeds have direct correlation to very specific land and people and region, right? And we have to protect them and showcase the value and continue to keep them alive with us, because they're a part of who we are too. They're a part of our ancestors. For the families and communities who have grown with them, we need to protect them. Really, we just really do, So it's important to find that seed diversity. It's important to explore what's out there and to see how valuable these are for us as Indigenous peoples, to be able to thrive and to grow with this diversity. And we see it, of course, we're lucky that we have this with the corn, with beans, with squash, So for us, that's just kind of an overview, but, what do we do with all that knowledge? Like, how do we do something with all of this? And this was our question as a team as we were building the sous chef. Like, how do we move forward? How do we keep this, how do we reintroduce indigenous foods and help build it out there and help get it into communities that just haven't had it around, to help break through the poverty and the oppression that we all faced as we grew up on a lot of tribal communities. And like, how do we learn from the past and how do we bring it into the future? So a lot of this work, we just started doing it. We just started we were just outside a lot, basically, because people would say like, oh, I was looking at your cookbook, but it's got cedar and I don't know where I can order that. Like, where do you get cedar? It's like, well, you have to go outside, it's just right. It's probably in your backyard, literally. And I see this as a Minnesota number, so it's literally in your backyard. So, but that's a part of it, was just being out, just making that happen, just doing it, like actively doing it, actively just being outdoors. And we live in a time where we have all these little wonder killers in our pockets. We have all these smartphones and there's apps where you can just take a picture of a plant and it tells you exactly what it is. Why not use all this technology for our benefit? Because we live in this age of so much information that we can utilize that, to help us relearn and to help us make it a part. Because when you start seeing plants again, you start seeing food everywhere. When you start to learn those plants, there's so much health and beauty around us, and it's like, you tell people to stop calling everything a weed because that just means you don't know what it is. Take the time to learn the names of the plants. It's the most important thing you can do. And take the time to process them, learn how to play with them, learn how to dry them, how to grind them into flours and powders, like make your own spice mixes. You don't have to have the exact same spice mixes that we've been using for all this time, because there's so many flavors right around us. You can make food taste like exactly where we are. And we just had fun doing this and creating a strong team of passionate chefs to be able to make this happen, or even creating businesses around it, right? When we first opened up Tatanka Truck, we were pretty sure we were either going to get run out of town for not having any fry bread, or but it turned out really, really good, because it was popular and we were focused on just regional foods. We were cooking only foods of this region, so primarily Dakota, Winnebago, Anishinaabe, and just the flavors of right where we were standing. That's what we were trying to do with the food, and no sugary drinks. The only drink we had on the truck was cedar maple tea. We had things like cedar, rabbit, wild rice, cranberries, maple, and you can literally stand in one spot in Minnesota and just look around and see all those ingredients all around you. And it's fun for chefs to be able to be creative and put all this on the plate and make it fun, have fun with it, but it was about keeping that food simple and just like letting it be what it is. And the most important part was getting this food out to the communities, especially some communities, well, just any communities, like just getting these, sometimes we go to communities and elders haven't had their traditional flavors in a long time, and it's amazing to see all these memories come out of them when they taste these foods for the first time in a long time. And it's so powerful to hear some of their stories. But everybody enjoys our indigenous foods, no matter how old you are, you can get it, but we have to get the kids. It has to be normal for the kids. It should just be out there always. We don't need to be serving sugars and cakes and sugary drinks and all that. We need to be serving indigenous foods for all of our gatherings. It just has to happen, and just teaching the kids to go backwards, like even land space. This is a map of where we're standing today. Dana's grandfather actually helped with this writing. There was a gentleman from here who created this, but these are all our waterways in the original Dakota and some Anishinaabe names. But when you look at the names of all these places, they're very particular to talking about the foods around them and what the areas were for. So it's a very special, thing. But we can decolonize our land space all over the place, We can do that today. So for us, like, how do we get this? We need to get this out there everywhere. We need to be more than just opening up a restaurant in Minnesota, was what we thought we were going to do originally. We wanted to try, because we saw the need for it everywhere, right? We should have indigenous restaurants in every single city, because you've got cities like New York, Chicago, LA, 0 Native American restaurants in any of those cities. We've got the Minneapolis American Indian Center has gathering cafes, so they've got one more than all 3 of those cities, right? And we just want to see this happen over and over everywhere. So we created our brand, our nonprofit 501c3 called NATIVS, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And we're creating a nonprofit restaurant that we're hoping we can be open as early as this next year, called Indigenous Food Lab. And Indigenous Food Lab is a nonprofit restaurant that's focused on training and education. So we're pushing back on those two pieces of colonialism that really hurt us badly, with taking away our education and taking away our food access. So we want to make our entire nonprofit about creating a space for Indigenous education that helps create Indigenous food access. So what we're trying to do is, it's a live restaurant where the public can come and enjoy Indigenous foods, but we want to use it as a training center so we can teach about all this curriculum we're developing around Indigenous foods. So we'll be able to teach about farming and agriculture. We'll be able to teach about wild foods and harvesting and plant identification. We'll be able to teach about all sorts of culinary aspects, nixtamalizing corn and food preservation. We'll be able to have language classes, history classes, even trauma classes. We'll be able to have all sorts of stuff. We just want to create a space for us to have Indigenous education that's accessible and it's hands-on and people can really enjoy it, right? But what we really want to do is work with the tribal communities nearby us, help them to develop some kind of Indigenous kitchen for their community that can be a source for Indigenous foods for their community, and help them make it about them and their language, about their tribe, about their land, about their flavors, and make it uniquely theirs, and help work with them to make that, and play a support system for them so we can always train their workers and always just support them to be there. And we want to be able to do this plan over and over, to be able to teach and create a curriculum and become a resource for Indigenous education down the road. So our plan is to start Indigenous Food Lab here in Minneapolis, and we're doing it in the urban area just because we know that there's a lot more resources in the urban area. But again, our goal is to reach out to those tribal communities, helping them to develop something nearby them. Because we want to be able to entice and help the communities find resources for community gardens, to landscape with permaculture, with food in mind, and just like utilizing spaces, utilizing structures that are already in place as teaching models, because we can use Dreamwild Health Farm, we can use Wajupi Farm as great models as teaching places too. And we want to be able to partner with a lot of our communities to be able to share what they have to offer with other communities to help all of us grow. But what we really need are those resources. Not every single tribe out there has access to a commercial kitchen. So we want to help develop that infrastructure of creating commercial kitchens that are focused on Indigenous foods, and can also double as incubator kitchens to help people develop, because we need a lot more food producers out there from Indigenous communities, and we can help them grow. We want to help them take those steps to become a small entrepreneur, because we need to see more and more food, and we can have a network that they can plug into right away so they'll be able to sell, because it's going to be important that we see more and more Indigenous focused food production businesses out there to be a part of our future, you know? Because if you can control your food, you can control your destiny, and that's what we really need to do as Indigenous peoples. Our final goal is to open up and mimic that model everywhere, and open up Indigenous food labs in every city possible. Each city being a regional center point to work with the tribal communities around it, and just create this vast network. And then we can see that future of being able to drive across the country, the nation, in any direction, and stopping at Indigenous-run focused food places all over the place, and see all that diversity. And we can learn so much if we connect ourselves through food. It gives us as Indigenous peoples an opportunity to define cultural appropriation around food, because we're not trying to commodify it, we're trying to make it accessible for everybody. You know, and we can have economic opportunity around these foods, but we really need to be able to talk about what that means. Because if you're non-native, just making a Native American restaurant because you think it's trendy, and you have no Native American people working for you, and you're not buying Native American foods on top of that, or supporting an Indigenous community, that's a clear definition of cultural appropriation. It's like selling Navajo jewelry if you're not Navajo, and calling it Navajo jewelry, right? It's no different than that. Because we live in a world where we see so much stereotypical bullshit when it comes to cultural appropriation. And we don't need to put up with this anymore as Indigenous peoples, you know? We're bigger than this. So we can have a voice, and we need to have voices to be able to rise up. And social media has been a great way to, you know, get on the rise. If something's wrong, people will get on it and things can change. We're seeing it all the time now because we need to be past this era because these things do not represent us as Indigenous peoples at all, not even close. We're extremely unique and diverse, and we can't be lump summed into one stereotypical cultural inappropriate piece, right? And it's really important as we grow that we define our own foods as Indigenous peoples too. We need that chance. So the last thing we need are European chefs telling us what our Indigenous foods are, right? Discovering our foods. We see that happening all the time on Food Network with people like, oh, I just discovered Oaxacan food. I'm going to build a high-end Oaxacan restaurant, But that's not what we need. We need to define our own foods, and we need to have the chance and the resources, and we have the right to. We can just do that anytime we want to, but we have to do it now, and we have to work hard to get these healthy foods out into our communities and do everything we can to make that future a reality. Because for us, this is an Indigenous evolution and revolution at the same time. It's breaking those chains of oppression and poverty, doing something about it, and making it a reality for our future generations, because you have to think about those future generations, They're the ones, our next generation of kids, they're the ones that are going to be the leaders. And just think about the next generation who are going to grow up knowing exactly what their Indigenous foods are because they have access to their Indigenous foods, and they're going to be able to be healthier. They're going to know the difference between how they feel when they eat Indigenous foods compared to how they eat when they eat a processed or fast food or any of those other foods. They're going to know, and they're going to be in a better space than we are. They're just going to grow up with it, and we have to teach them that. We have to get that food into the school systems. We have to get it everywhere. It has to be a part of it. And we can be role models as Indigenous peoples here if we can accomplish that to help other people around the globe do the same thing and reverse those ancient so-called trade routes and turn them into decolonized routes all across the board and help our brothers and sisters throughout Africa and India and Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii, South America, Central America, all of it, because it needs to happen everywhere. Because you can be the answer to your ancestor prayers, but you have to get out there and do it. You have to start today. There's no other time. And this room is filled with so many amazing people, and I love this conference because I just get to see so many people doing positive things and doing this, and we're all part of this movement together. It's happening. There's this huge movement of chefs happening, and academics and seed savers and farmers and growers and educators, and there's so much going on. We all need to be a part of it, All right, thank you.